Human Rights and the New Administration, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. During the last 8 years, the Bush administration's war on terror included practices that, in the eyes of many observers, compromise the U.S. image as a human rights champion. A 2007 survey by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs found that a majority of respondents in 18 countries thought the U.S. could not be trusted to act responsibly on the world stage. In response, Barack Obama has promised to pursue security in, quote, a manner that is consistent with our values and our ideals, unquote. For a look at our nation's present global standing in the era of human rights and what the Obama administration can do to reestablish America's moral authority, we're pleased to be joined by a leading international human rights advocate. William Shulz is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, specializing in human rights. From 1994 to 2006, he served as executive director of Amnesty International USA. Reviewing one of his books, the New York Review of Books said he has, quote, done more than anyone in the American human rights movement to make human rights issues known in the United States. Bill, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you, Rob. Good to be with you.
So we're talking about this relatively amorphous concept of moral authority, and I wonder if we could do a little bit of a baseline here, if we will. It's not an issue that is as quantifiable as the numbers of troops in the military or the trade balance, but it is, at least to some, a source of power. And I'm wondering if you could describe what that power is. What is moral authority, and why is it of interest to the United States?
Well, international law, of which human rights law is a part, is different from domestic law in one crucial sense. There's no sheriff or policeman down the street who's prepared to enforce international law, at least not consistently, as presumably our law enforcement officers are with regard to domestic law. And even in the cases of genocide, as we saw in Rwanda and as we're seeing today in Darfur, even in the cases of the worst human rights violations, the major powers, the United Nations, often fail to enforce international human rights law. That means that to the extent to which human rights are going to be enforced, they are going to be enforced in large measure through some kind of soft power or moral authority. Most nations, like most individuals, want to think of themselves as law-abiding people. When we conform more or less to the speed limit, we do so not just because we think we may be pulled over by a cop, but we do so because we want to see ourselves as law-abiding people. And in part, that's because opinion leaders want to impress upon us the importance of that. And that's why, when it comes to human rights, the model that the United States and other great powers display is so important. The moral authority that we display is, in human rights terms, far more important, actually, in most cases, than any kind of military action we may take.
All right, so that would then sort of set up a devil's advocate type of question. Those would say, yes, it is this. There is no, sheriff out there, and it is a tough world. And it's because of that when issues of security are in play, issues of human rights become in a clear second. And that people, in the World Trade Centers, when those buildings were on fire, weren't thinking about protecting the human rights of people internationally. They were worried about their security, and aren't most Americans more concerned about their sort of physical safety than they are about a more amorphous concept of human rights?
Well, and indeed, the right to life, the right to be secure, is a human right. But your question presumes, or the premises of that challenge presume, that there is some kind of zero-sum game at work between security and human rights. And the reality is that when we violate human rights, we often compromise our security in very significant ways. The recent decision by President Obama to close Guantanamo Bay within 1 year is a good example of that. If we looked at it sheerly in terms of a traditional view of security, we might say, well, we got 800 bad guys off the street. But in fact, we know that of the some 800 who are incarcerated there, 500 to 600 of them shouldn't have ever been there in the first place. They're now back in their own home populations, and they are now talking about their experience and about the United States. And Guantanamo has tarnished our image enormously and fed the propaganda that terrorists use to alienate people from the United States. And in fact, that's a perfect example of how respect for human rights and security needs go hand in hand in the vast majority of cases.
If you look at concrete examples like, say, in Afghanistan or Iraq, or even a place like the Congo, is pursuit of human rights addressing those immediate situations? In other words, we say that security in Iraq or stability in Afghanistan is critical to our security here. Does respect for human rights need to be a part of how we deal with those situations?
Well, absolutely. If we look at Iraq, we certainly see very readily that the failure in some instances by the U.S., by the Iraqi government, to abide by fundamental human rights standards, fundamental forms of democracy, risks alienating people within the population and destabilizing the society. And that's really the critical point. Ultimately, very few societies, if any, can remain stable if significant populations of people within those societies feel that they are being discriminated against, feel that their most fundamental needs are not being addressed by the central government. Without that, without a sense of participation in the government, a place to take one's grievances, rights to which one can appeal to protect one's interests, without that, most societies find themselves at significant odds with themselves.
So then if we say there is not this choice between security and human rights, and they can be part of the same strategy, it makes me think of a question which, forgive me if this is too academic a question, but forever there is a debate in U.S. foreign policy about whether we should be realists or idealists or both. So how would you see the claim that human rights as part of a security strategy? Is it because of the need to be true to ideals? Is it out of a cold, calculating sort of realist assessment, or both?
It's absolutely both. Human rights certainly are part of the American tradition. They certainly are part of our ideals as a people. We see ourselves as people who promote human rights, and indeed, we've been a model in many respects for constitutions, for societies around the world as they try to form their own guidelines and rules with regard to how they want to treat one another. But at the same time, human rights is in the United States' best interests, and it is in very practical terms. I'll give you one very good example. We know that manufacturing and other jobs flow overseas when other countries fail to respect labor rights and therefore are able to produce products at a much lower cost than we can do here in the United States. We know that the environment is damaged when environmental defenders in some countries who try to speak up against practices in their own countries that are damaging the environment are then targeted by corporations or by their governments themselves. All of those play against the U.S.'s realpolitik interests. And in that sense, human rights is a dual concern of both idealists and realists.
So then if we turn to the current challenges that the Obama administration faces in this regard, how do you assess the state of U.S. moral authority now? If that's a source of power, how are we doing on that front?
Well, there's no question that over the last 8 years, the state of our moral authority has plunged very significantly. One can't be identified with the use of torture as we were at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, and indeed at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. One can't be associated with Guantanamo Bay in terms of its denial of basic due process standards and not have one's image tarnished. And I think that perhaps very few Americans realize how badly those two things in particular damage the United States' interest around the world. On the other hand, I think this can be repaired relatively quickly. And the President has already taken two very significant steps. I mentioned the announcement that Guantanamo Bay will be closed. There are all sorts of problems, practical problems in how you do that, but that will happen within a year. And the President has expanded the prohibition on torture that has always applied to the U.S. military to the U.S. intelligence services, and has made very clear that we're not going to torture. The new Attorney General has said, contrary to the past administration, that waterboarding is torture and will be prohibited. So these are very, very important steps. But at the same time, the U.S. needs to take some additional steps that will signal that not only is it cleaning up its own act, but it wants to be part of the larger international community in a constructive way.
I want to talk more about some of those specific steps and the maybe more complex or ambitious ones. Before we do that, though, what's the desired outcome in terms of how it would affect both leaders abroad, key leaders abroad particularly, and international public opinion? So what's the desired impact we want to have on those people?
Well, I think we want to reestablish the United States as a leader in human rights, as representing an imperfect norm, to be sure, because we know very well what our own problems here are, but nonetheless a significant norm that other countries can live up to. We want to remove the opportunity that Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe and the Chinese leadership has to claim that they can persecute some of their own populations because the United States has done the same thing in the war on terror. In that sense, we want to clean the deck and return ourselves to at least some measure of significant leadership as a human rights champion.
We've got just a minute or so before our break, and I wonder if we could start to dig into what other steps the Obama administration could make. There are obviously some things you referred to that are almost could be done by executive decree, the torture guidelines, etc. What are some other more ambitious steps that we could take?
Well, first, before our break, let me mention some modest steps, and then afterwards we can talk about the more ambitious ones. The United States can stand for election to the UN Human Rights Council. We have not been part of the Council. We should be part of the Council despite its limitations. The United States can agree to send representatives to the review conference that will be reviewing the statutes of the International Criminal Court. We're not a part of the court. We should be a part of the court, but we're not going to be, at least for a while. It has to be ratified by the Senate. So the President can re-sign that treaty, which President Bush unsigned, and can indicate that we're going to renew conversations about U.S. participation in the court. Those are two very easy things and important things we can do. We can look at some of the treaties that we've failed to ratify, like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that every country except the U.S. and Somalia has ratified. We can look at the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on Disabilities. These are important things that we can do that will send a very critical signal.
So I want to follow up on some of those steps as well after our break. We're going to take a break here on International Focus and come back and talk more about human rights and restoring U.S. moral authority in just a moment.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our discussion of human rights and restoring U.S. moral authority in the world. We're talking with Bill Shulz, former Executive Director of Amnesty International USA and currently at the Center for American Progress. Bill, I want to push into what you referred to as more modest steps, because they may not be so modest, which are joining some of the conventions like the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Genocide Convention, etc. The Torture Convention. It hasn't just been the Bush administration who has not necessarily agreed to those. What is it that makes it difficult for American leadership to buy into those treaties and really support them?
Well, certainly there is a strain within the American tradition that is exceptionalist, sovereigntist, if you will, that believes that the United States should in general not be part of international treaties or conform our own domestic laws to international law because of a sense that America is the best, that American law is the best, that the American criminal justice system is the best. On the other hand, the United States has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's ratified the Convention Against Torture. It's ratified the Genocide Convention. And in the case, for example, of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the major objection to that in the past was that it outlawed the execution of those under the age of 18. But now, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled unconstitutional the execution of those under the age of 18, and so that removes that obstacle from the deck. So in this sense, I think that while it's never easy to get an international human rights treaty ratified, I think there are some treaties that the consensus of opinion, particularly with a Democratic majority in the Congress, in the Senate, may make more possible.
You mentioned the International Criminal Court. I wonder if you could describe that and talk a little bit about, again, why the Bush administration unsigned the treaty that President Clinton had signed and where that might go from here.
Well, we should say that President Clinton signed that treaty on the very last day of his presidency so that he had no time to submit it to the Senate and indicated he wouldn't do so. So it wasn't only the Bush administration that has been skeptical, I think erroneously skeptical. The International Criminal Court has the potential of being the most significant human rights development in the last 20 years. It creates, at least potentially, and the jury is out as to whether it will work as we hope it will, but it creates at least potentially a structure of international judicial accountability before which those leaders who commit genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity can be brought to trial and eventually brought to justice. And the court has indicted, for example, the president of Sudan, Mr. Bashir, who, along with many others, is at least allegedly responsible for genocide and very serious crimes against humanity. Now, the U.S. has resisted being a part of the court, in part, again, because of that concern about sovereignty, in part because of concern that a capricious prosecutor might select individual American civilian or military leaders for prosecution. But there is a principle within the statutes of the ICC called the principle of complementarity, which holds that if someone is indicted by the court, that person's home judicial system, that national's home system, may take the case under its jurisdiction, may try the case, in this case an American court, and if the individual who's been indicted by the ICC is found not guilty, that resolves the issue and the ICC no longer has authority. So this is a pretty clear protection, even if there were capricious prosecutions, which it's highly unlikely that there would be.
Well, let's take a hypothetical situation where, let's say, former Vice President Cheney is traveling abroad. The ICC has issued a secret indictment against him for war crimes, and he's taken into custody. What happens?
Well, technically, I should say that because the U.S. hasn't joined the court can't reach Vice President Cheney or anyone else.
If we ratify it, yeah.
But in the future, were there to be a Vice President Cheney in the future, presumably the court might indict someone like that. And presumably the United States would then claim jurisdiction or claim authority to try that individual under the principles of American jurisprudence. And if future Vice President Cheney is found not guilty by an American court, then that resolves the issue.
There may be those who would say, yeah, and are we really losing anything by not being part of the court? So if we are part, we could risk these kinds of possibly politically motivated, cases. So why even take the risk? What are we losing by not being a part of the court?
Well, if we ask the same question about domestic law, the answer would be obvious. What are we losing if we don't have a system that prosecutes rape and murder? The reality is that once you establish a legal norm, the vast majority of people abide by that norm, again, whether they expect to be prosecuted or not. My guess is that after Bashir in Sudan and a few other leaders who are responsible for war crimes, genocide, or crimes against humanity, after they have been successfully prosecuted by an international criminal court, my guess is that we will begin to see far, far fewer leaders of countries exploiting their own citizens, violating the responsibility to protect that all governments have to their own citizens, and committing these horrendous crimes. And these crimes inevitably not only destabilize the regions in which they take place, but often draw the U.S. in, often draw the international community in ways that waste resources, that deflect attention from far more serious issues, that undermine our efforts to build development and to fight poverty around the world. So in innumerable ways, if we had a system in place before which we could bring people like this, and if that threat existed over the heads of those who might be tempted to commit these kinds of crimes, in the long run, this would be enormously to the United States' advantage. We wouldn't have to be the world's policeman that so many people don't want us to be, particularly after Iraq.
If we look at a situation like Sudan, like Darfur, and this norm of the responsibility to protect, which says that if nations do not protect their own citizens or are abusing their own citizens, the international community has the right to intervene and protect those people. I may have.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, that's correct.
So then people would say, well, you know, what's happening in Sudan or in Darfur is not an issue of legality; it's an issue of political will, and that even the Bush administration said there was genocide happening there. Yet there has been a lack of a really strong international commitment. So would adherence to, or admission to the International Criminal Court or adherence to these human rights standards really make a difference? Is it really just a question of politics?
It certainly is a question of politics and of will. There's no question about that. But let me just paint a different scenario for you. Let's assume that the United States had never intervened in Iraq. Let's assume that we had stuck with Afghanistan, if not finished the job, at least continued to move successfully there with the support of the vast majority of the world. And instead of engaging in Iraq, let's assume the United States had joined with its European allies and with other countries around the world to push for and to establish a significant UN African Union peacekeeping force in Darfur, Sudan, something that we probably could have done had we not been bogged down in Iraq. I submit that had we taken that kind of leadership and had we said, here is the first instance in which the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which was voted in 2005 by the United Nations, is being challenged, and we're going to step up to our human rights champion role and leadership role, and we're going to see that this is an effective intervention force, peacekeeping force in Sudan. I think that would have paid enormous dividends, not just in Darfur, but for the future in other potential Darfurs.
If we look at staying on kind of the political angle on this, and you looked at what the Obama administration has in front of it. You know, you mentioned several steps that it could take. What are the political challenges, both domestically and internationally, that they'll face, and how could they deal with those?
Well, of course, the obvious challenge at the moment is the economy, and that it has to be, and appropriately is the major focus of the administration, and no doubt will be for a significant period of time. At the same time, I don't think that the administration can ignore human rights issues, because when they're ignored, they so often unravel other situations. And probably the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an obvious one, a situation in which both sides have committed significant human rights violations. To have ignored all that, as the Bush administration did, at least until the last 6 months or year of its tenure, has obviously resulted in a far more explosive situation in the Middle East than we might otherwise have found. And similarly, whether it be Russia or China, while the United States can't by itself change the human rights practices of those countries, to emphasize only economics, for example, in relationship to China, and to totally fail to bring human rights concerns to the table sends the Chinese a signal of adventurism potentially, a signal that they can get away with some behaviors that they might otherwise not be able to do. And in the long run, again, that destabilizes that part of the world, if not, in the case of China, the whole world, because it's such an important player in that respect.
As a former executive director of a civil society organization like Amnesty, I assume you're not putting all this on the shoulders of President Obama or his administration. What is it that people in either organizations like Amnesty or the grassroots can do to help promote or propel these changes?
There are an enormous number of things. Amnesty International, I have to say, a little plug from my old organization, has been involved with direct action, influencing governments, not just the U.S. by any means, influencing well over 100 governments to release political prisoners. More than 40,000 prisoners were released as a matter of people making witness to violations of human rights. There are ways to support labor, for example, labor rights, to monitor the performance of various kinds of corporations and to conform one's own decisions about purchasing to those kinds of standards that one wants to promote. There are ways to, of course, be involved with both our state and national governments at addressing problems, human rights problems here in the United States, and we have them here, starting with the death penalty, but also dealing with issues of the right to health care, the right to education, the right to a fair wage. These are issues that people can be involved in that are often not framed as human rights issues because we in the United States are so reticent to talk about economic and social rights, but in fact are rights issues as well. So there are many, many ways in which people can be involved.
We're down to less than a minute. I'm wondering if there's one place you would have, or one piece of advice you'd give to President Obama as to where to start down this road.
Well, I think that the key is to signal, as he has certainly begun doing, is to send one signal after another that the U.S. is back in the international ballgame. What we want to create here is not just a powerful human rights leader in the United States. What we want to create is a far more powerful international system, international regimen of support. A criminal court, yes, but an effective human rights council. We want to create that structure, and the U.S. can help do that by sending those signals.
Bill Shulz, Center for American Progress, and formerly of Amnesty International USA, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
And to our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.